A big thank you to the organizers of this person-centered experiential therapies conference. Sadly, I am not able to be with you in person and to enjoy a more lively live interaction. And who knows, though, this might be a beginning of a conversation which I hope to have with you. Old friends and maybe new friends. I remember being taken by surprise at first by Tony, I'll give him this name, my client, by Tony's youthful enthusiasm, his fierce intelligence, his confidence. I will not present here a case study, at least not in the conventional sense, and I will therefore take the freedom to bypass background story as well as all the first starts and stops of our initial tentative steps at establishing what goes under the name traditionally of therapeutic relationship or therapeutic alliance. All the same, this is for all intents and purposes an account of a therapeutic relationship, even though it remains to be seen whether Tony alone, my client, or both Tony and myself, the therapist, the one who is privileged with congruence, empathy, and UPR, also benefit from it. It certainly is the account of a therapeutic relationship, even though it remains to be seen whether the relating in question is merely that, relating, that is, attempting to construct together a dance, to dance together, attempting to find a discernible way of communicating across the divide that separates self from other, me from you, or if you prefer a more romantic language, I from thou. Merely relating means that the ship of relationship, the vessel gliding on the waters of uncharted rivers, the river of Tony's experience and my own, is not necessarily there. There isn't a ship, there is only relating. I remember being taken by surprise by Tony's presence, the ease he has with the world. He had to learn the ways of the world early on in life because he lost both parents to cancer in brief succession, within months, first his mother, then his father, when he was only 12. Attachment issues, one might say, of course. Learning to trust the world that didn't offer, after such a terrible loss, solid reasons to be trusted. Unreliable foster care parents, early exposed to neglect, even cruelty. And there is another side, as we know, some of us know, to the attachment system, which is actually overlooked in traditional attachment theory. It is called line of flight. It is also called becoming orphan. It has to do, simply put, with recreating in the wilderness of uncertainty and of loneliness, very real loneliness, a new net, a new network of sustainability, a web of love, a beehive of care. Tony and I worked for nearly 10 years, on and off, with some interruptions, breaks, endings, with the door always left ajar. First we met in my apartment, my flat, this very same place in London. Then with COVID, we met online when COVID took over the reins of the world. Then we met again in a rented room in a new practice in a leafy part of town. Through all these changes of gear, of tonalities, of priorities, Tony and I also became changed or transformed. And in our relating without relationship, without vessel, without the sanitized frame where all one does is tick boxes all the way to retirement, a fundamental transformation took place in him and in me. Both changes or transformations unexpected, unwarranted, and quite difficult to convey, which is precisely why I'm now attempting to convey them to you. There have been many versions of us in this process. There have been many shifts, many movements. But there is one, maybe two, one certainly that stands out. And a moment in our work together, which Tony later on remarked upon, months later, in fact. There was a particular shift. Let me be clear. I am not I'm not talking here about an epiphany, not at any particular so-called depth of relating. No. The sun didn't stream benevolently through the window. There was no mystical or gnostic revelation. There was no particular felt sense that confirmed that we have reached the key insight, the key transformative moment. No, sir, none of that happened. The shift was ordinary. To be sure, there have been other changes, other signposts that announce the change of rhythm. I might or I might not refer to this later, but the one I am certain I want to tell you about happened some 2 years ago, I think. Yeah, it happened after a break of a couple of months of our weekly meetings. The break had been the culmination of a rather long period during which Tony had expressed and at times implied a dissatisfaction with what he called my relentless positivity, my inviting him to look at the bright side of their experience, my persistent attitude of encouragement and appreciation. I had been incapable of naming, holding the unbearable grief simmering just under the surface of his confident exterior. I had, in other words, believed the myriad ways and modalities in which Tony had so successfully coped with their grief. Losing his parents at such a young age, going through vicissitude and foster care, etc. At a young age, he had learned the ways of the world, how to be successful enough in any endeavor. At times, this would be, he started studying literature, university, then he started managing in his late teens pop bands, the manager in music in the A&R department. Later, a bit later on, and partly parallel to our work together, he started making art and making a mark and making some really good work that began to be appreciated. You could say, having to cope in the world, having to survive and live after such tremendous grief, he had to wear a mask, or several masks. And the thing is, I believed and trusted in his masks. That was because I've always understood the making of a mask as a work of art, a way not simply to cope, but to engage creatively with the world and its very real challenges. I believe, I did tell him as much, putting my view on the table, so to speak, for scrutiny and discussion. I believed in all that. I also owned my skepticism about the so-called real self. Some of us may call it organismic self, if you fancy that rather ambivalent term, or authentic self, if you are on the side of Heidegger. Whatever. Tony agreed with me that he, coping with the world and creating this mask, if you will, had served a good purpose. But he also wanted me to know that the many ways in which grief, of the many ways, he wanted me to know that grief was real, and sometimes it was still on him. It would come on inadvertently, unexpectedly. He would say, you know, I might be sitting on my desk in the morning, having made some time to work, to do my art, and I would feel paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of anxiety. At first diffuse, he would say, would be silent, uncanny, and then slowly turning into a muted scream, Edward Munch painting, still reverberating a century and a half ago, a howling grief that traversed me, I'm paraphrasing my client, traversed me with a blind desire to inhabit my heart and soul forever, as if the scream, Edward Munch's scream, had become part of his being, always there as a kind of a background. This is real enough, we both agreed. And there were other ways, Tony said. There are other ways in which grief manifests itself. The tears that will come suddenly, unheeded, unwarranted, but not completely unprovoked, but provoked by an almost trivial disappointment. Tears of disenchantment for a lover withdrawing their love without warning, or his realization that in matters of the heart, there is no really room for contractual agreement, but only for mercy. I'm talking about his feeling of abandonment and uncertainty when his ex would suddenly withdraw her affection, their affection. And it's not that either of us, in our different roles, really paid heed to the notion that the overwhelmed self, the grieving, howling, desperate self, is the real self. Not at all. Neither of us believe that. And I still don't. The sadness, the grief, the despair that might come out in relation to life's challenges. It's definitely another aspect, another artful, crafty mask through which the living organism does its wondrous thing, through which the living organism, you might say, sings its song and dances its dance. It was at this point in our conversations that I felt the urge to spell out for him something. It for me came up so clear and strong. I told Tony, you know, my intention here is that you become free of me. I have no investment, emotional or otherwise, in you going this way or going that way, in you staying or leaving. In you going right or left, making this decision or that decision, in you leaving the relationship or staying in the relationship. This is one of the ways in which I understand unconditional positive regard, and I'm not saying anything new here. The ability to hold whatever aspect, whatever configuration, some people would say, in my language, whatever useful, artful mask you will bring to this conversation. Around this time in our work, I dreamt that Tony and I were walking the alleys and little streets of a town asleep at night. Tony is telling me in a dream about gigs, about concerts he has been to. One in particular that he liked the night before, a concert with a band, with a rock band, pop band. It's ages since I've been to a gig, to a concert, I say. Tony in the dream is warm, affectionate towards me. There is what you might call an atmosphere of good understanding. Instinctive, unspoken understanding between us. In the dream also the boundaries between therapy and client had dissolved. And he asked me in the dream again, why did you ring me? Did you call me as a friend? I tried to answer, but failed in the dream. So 2.5 years ago, I think it was already the beginning of COVID, beginning of, just over 2 years ago. After a break of a few months, we resumed our sessions, our meetings. This time we couldn't meet in person. COVID had begun to dictate those things. So as all of us, we were online, and eventually we met in person. So the online work was on and off, and I'll skip quickly through that. I was happy eventually to resume face-to-face work. I would leave my apartment at 7:15 in the morning. I would walk from Hampstead to Primrose Hill, allowing my impressions, my thoughts and feeling to traverse my body freely. It's just such a wonderful time of day to walk. And I found this walk in the morning a very good way to get ready to receive the first client. I noticed a change of seasons. I noticed at the same time every morning I meet certain people at certain street corners. It's a good 40 minutes walk. So that's around the time when I started working in person with him again. And he was keen to tell me about many important changes that happened to him, many things that happened to him. A new painful relationship with someone he looked up to, someone withholding a love and exposing his own real fear of abandonment. He said that the impetus to want to see me again regularly this time and in person was remembering that statement of mine when I said to him, I want you to become free of me. I want this work to lead to that moment of freedom, of autonomy. For him, he said, it undid a knot, untied a knot, a transferential entanglement that he had felt with me. Possibly to do with the fact that I am of the age his father would have been if he had not died all those years back. In relation to transference, he also said to me, very interestingly, he said, did you know, by the way, why Socrates ended up in trouble? Why he was sentenced to death by the Athenian tribunal? He said, "No, tell me." It was because he didn't understand, Socrates did not understand the transference. He added with a grin, and we both laughed. He would come up with gems like that, like intuitions, things he thought about, things he read, films, that I would find it incredibly rich, incredibly meaningful. Socrates was sentenced to death because he had not understood the power of the transference, the power of what Athenian citizens has projected onto him, on this troublemaker, on this gadfly. Anyway, weeks went by in the work, then months. And then the second shift happened. We are now in July, beginning of July. Towards the beginning of April, and more strongly by, say, mid to end of April, I became ill with kidney failure. I had kidney failure and was rushed to hospital. Doctors in England don't call it kidney failure anymore. They call it acute kidney injury. Basically, my kidneys went right down. They were hardly working. And I could say I was saved by a very active, proactive doctor. But it's not called kidney failure, which I find interesting. The notion of failure, the word failure, is a kind of taboo. The idea that to fail is integral, part and parcel of human experience. Fail again, fail better, Samuel Beckett. This idea is incomprehensible, that human failure is an important part of human experience, is incomprehensible in our world of ever-expansive growth, whether it's growth of the economy, whether it's the growth of tomatoes and courgettes in a vegetable garden, whether it is spiritual, psychological growth, or even so-called post-traumatic growth. Anyway, the situation was such that it didn't allow me to send messages to each client or supervisee to say that I would be out of action for the foreseeable future. I notified my executor, who sent a brief collective message. Long story short, during my week in hospital, they found I have cancer. And after the shock and grief and sadness and bewilderment, why me, God? God answers, why not? I slowly resumed some clinical work after a few weeks. And when I meet Tony, he tells me how anxious he has been for me. He tells me through the tears how sad, how lost he felt, and how much love he felt for me. He asked me about the illness. I told him. Remember, he lost mother and father at a tender age. His father died not long after his mother was given a death sentence, basically, and died shortly after his diagnosis. He died of the same illness, the same place in the body that befell on me. That day, we cried together. We cried tears of sorrow and tears of joy. For Spinoza, and I'm thinking of my dear, dear friend Claudio Rudd, who loved Spinoza and helped me understand this great philosopher. For Spinoza, emotions and feelings, any emotion and feeling, primary emotion and feeling, when it's allowed to travel, to do its thing, if we're allowed to move through us, every feeling leads to joy. So Tony's tears and my tears were, in our sessions, were tears of joy. They freed us up. They made us free for that brief moment. Tony had moved way past being dependent. He who had always been autonomous, he whose autonomy I always cherished, because I believe autonomy is the most important quality in person-centered therapy, in any form of therapy. Tony could allow himself, we could both allow ourselves these tears of joy. He was freed from the fear of losing me. And I was freed from the constriction of wearing a garment. It made my garment not invisible, as Carl Rogers would say. It made the garment vanish into thin air. At that time, we are now in mid-May this year, I was still in the dark about my prognosis, and this meant I felt more vulnerable and also more open, which meant also that sorrow was in the room, and fear, and then tenderness and joy, rather than, instead of two islands, two monads. Instead of two monads stuck in their boundaried roles. Question: what are boundaries for? To create a container for, to allow, invite, host something that might happen, a change, transformation, or a container of, something that limits, encircles through attachment to an ideology, be it psychoanalytic or person-centered, or gestalt, or emotion-focused, or whatever it might be. A tight container that is there for fear that life might burst through the open window in the counseling room. A container that becomes then a prison. Tony's autonomy and my own vulnerability made possible this important shift. And there is more, which I will explore with my beloved Ukrainian colleagues next week at their conference. But here I want to say a few things which I hope to write more in my forthcoming book, shameless plug, book called Subversion and Desire, will come out in the later this year. Okay. And here is the final thing. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. Karl Marx, 1867, preface to the first German edition of Das Kapital. And then he adds in French, le mort saisit le vif, that is, the dead seize, take hold of the living. This is open to many interpretations. We are affected by the real presence of the dead, those who came before us, our loved ones who died, our friends and colleagues who are no longer with us. I'm thinking of two great and original contributors to the person-centered approach, Peter Schmidt and Pete Saunders. In my client's case, the very real presence of in his mind, body and soul, of his father and mother, present and alive, affecting and moving within his being, and to whom he dedicated his artistic work. Now, this is the affective side of historicity, understood with Auguste Comte as the presence of the dead through artifacts, be they them the streets we walk on. People have built them before, people who are now dead, be they buildings we live in, be they books and works that we read and absorb. Indeed, there would be no tradition, person-centered or otherwise, without the work of many practitioners who are now gone, who came before us. And there is also finally, another meaning to that phrase. The dead sees the living. I'm thinking of contemporary biology, and in particular the work of Jean-Claude Ameisen, whose book La sculpture du vivant, the sculpture of the living, is not yet translated into English. Anyway, this is the point. The living organism relies on the presence of non-life within itself as the very condition of life. Let me quote Jean-Claude Ameisen before I conclude. From the first days of conception, he writes, at the very moment our existence begins, cellular suicide plays an essential role in our body in the course of construction, sculpting, successive metamorphosis of our form in becoming. Non-life within a living organism becomes a kind of a deposit or a storage which is useful for further individuation. The life of the organism, he concludes, is a kind of inhibited death, mort empêchée. Finally, it has been argued in our tradition, person-centered tradition, that often the way in which an actualizing organism is portrayed in our literature is as an ever-expanding, light-seeking potato in the cellar, sprouts in the cellar, a touching image, for sure. But not enough attention has been paid to entropy. What I'm adding here, inspired by contemporary biology, is a dialectical synthesis of these two views, ever-expanding, growing organism actualizing, and entropy. And to spell it out, the living organism depends on non-life within it, in the same way as we are seized by and indebted to the legacy of the dead. The living organism, the philosopher Elizabeth Gross adds, relies on a kind of memory and inherence of the past in the present. Understood in this way, the living organism is not a stable phenomenon, one at rest or equilibrium, but instead metastable, constantly taking form. In the Japanese avant-garde dance theater practice that I'm a student of, called Buto, the dancer takes on different forms. I can speak and move as my father, or as dance as an oak tree, or as a caterpillar dying and becoming a butterfly. With all respect for those renowned potatoes in the cellar, I find the notion of the caterpillar, the destruction of the caterpillar that gives room to such a wondrous being as the butterfly, more appealing. Tony made a beautiful work of art dedicated to his parents. More than that, his parents move within him, within his mind and body. For my part, his tears of sorrow and joy in learning of my own mortality enlivened and enriched my own experience, and our work deepened and continues to deepen. And for that, I am grateful. Thank you, dear colleagues and friends, for making time to listen. Keep well.